Vicky, good morning. It's great to meet you.
Morning, lovely to meet you too.
Yeah, thank you for making the time. We've had a few conversations online, but this is as close as we'll get to in real life at the moment. At least we can see each other and have a proper conversation. So
yeah, definitely. I'm looking forward to it. Thank you
good
for
to
the
be here.
invitation.
So as we've talked about, this is a series of what I'm calling Sentientist Conversations, and they're centered around this idea of a really super simple, practical philosophy called Sentientism. And it tries to answer the two most fundamental questions in philosophy, and some might say life. What's real? What should we believe in? And what matters morally? What should we care about? What should we have compassion about? And this sentientism idea simply says we should have evidence and reason when we're thinking about what's real, and we should have compassion for all sentient beings, hence the name. And that's it, really. It leaves everything else open. So this is a series of conversations about people who both agree with that philosophy and don't. Conversation could go anywhere we like, but it will center around those two central questions of what's real and what matters, and then thinking about the implications for the future. But before we get into that, it'd be good if you could just, for people who don't know your work, give us a quick introduction to yourself and your focus.
Yes, thanks so much. So I'm Vicky Bond. I'm Managing Director for the Humane League in the UK. And I've been at the Humane League for 4 years now. We work to end the abuse of animals raised for food. But how I got here is a little bit different probably from what people might imagine. I actually trained as a vet, and it was through my work in veterinary training, and actually prior to that I'd been working on some farms, and after that I really realized how broken the food system was, how much animals suffered, and as a vet felt very helpless really. In that it was more firefighting than it was really getting to the root cause. So you go on dairy farms, particularly where I was at Liverpool Vet School, and there's a lot of dairy, and we see a lot of problems based on the fact that these animals produce so much milk. And so you'd be there to do abdominal surgery and things on these cows, because just simply because of the way that their food and the diet and the amount of milk they have to produce would cause so much suffering. And we'd be doing like lining up 4 cows a day on some farms to do this because the ration would be wrong and everything. I couldn't quite believe it, and definitely felt like I didn't want to be part of it, that I wanted to change it. And when I left vet school, I did work as a vet for a short period, but then I also went and did some work with other groups, did some lobbying, did some research projects, and then went to Compassion and Wild Farming, which is a charity that works to end factory farming. And I was in the research team there. And actually, prior to that, I'd been vegetarian, and I knew better, but I was probably in a mindset where it seemed quite extreme at the time to be vegan in vet school. There was only a few vegetarians, as there was. So, and that really opened my eyes even further when I started getting into the science that we never really got taught in veterinary. We never really got taught about the real basic fundamentals that needed to change to help animals. And then went from there to working in the food business team. And the food business team works with major businesses to improve animal welfare in their supply chain. I did that across so many different species, and ended up doing work with people on their farms and in slaughterhouses. And then the Humane League decided they were moving. They started in the US, they founded there, and they wanted to have an office in Europe, and they were looking at the UK. And so I started doing corporate outreach with the Humane League, and we've grown from just 2 people, myself and Prue, who's the campaigns at the time. We're now a group of 15. We're a registered charity. We're doing this institutional change, which is the thing that really is about making the difference, where rather than small kind of incremental little bits here and there, maybe getting people to change their diet, which is an important part of it, the real institutional change can make the biggest impact on reducing suffering. And when I came to the Humane League, I really felt like I found my people, because when I met Dave, it was actually at a Sentience conference in Berlin where I met him, that was organised by Sentience Politics. And it was an amazing conference. And I just thought, oh my goodness, this is how I've been thinking. And I just didn't know there was people that also thought like this. About sentience and about suffering. And it was really wonderful to kind of meet a community of people that viewed the suffering in the sort of the same way I did, in this overarching kind of amount of suffering, the degree of suffering that animals endure, particularly at the hands of humans in farming, and the kind of desire to push to end this. And to do that is very much about being pragmatic in a world where we can't suddenly change everything. We can at least reduce the extreme amounts of suffering that happens to so many animals, so many billions of animals every year.
Yeah,
so yeah, that's
brilliant.
How we got here.
Thank you. I mean, and we'll touch on many of those themes that you've already hinted at. It's quite a story, and the role of vets is particularly fascinating. I'm sure you've come across this to many in the animal advocacy movement, because of course their central role is about caring for non-human animals and having that, you know, that compassion. But at the same time, vets that are caught up in the machinery of animal farming almost have to survive, have to have an even more extreme version of cognitive dissonance than, you know, than the average person. So yeah, that will be fascinating to come back to, about how your moral circle has shifted and how you've thought those issues through. I'd like to start in a different place, which is the first question of sentientism, of how to even decide what's real in the first place. And it would be good to, if you don't mind, roll the clock right back to think about how your philosophies evolved over time about, you know, what even is real. And an interesting place to start is whether you grew up in a you know, an atheistic or a naturalistic household or a religious household. Have those views stuck with you over time, or have they changed? If you don't mind telling us that story, that would be interesting to cover.
Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up in, well, my mother is Christian, Church of England, and actually my grandfather was a vicar. But then my father was kind of agnostic, probably almost atheist, I would say. But it meant I went to church, and I actually was I went to church regularly until I was a teenager. I think Christianity did play like a big background role in my life when I was a child. I kind of got to 13, 14, 15, I think it was a bit vague, and really started kind of questioning, really? Are we sure? How do we know this? And I'd read the Bible, and I was a bit like, oh, it's a bit, I'm not sure I agree with all these points. But also my grandma died when I was 14. And I think that was really, I was trying to think about this question like in advance, and it was a turning point, I think, because when she died, you know, it's like, oh, she's watching over us and everything else. And I thought, oh, that's kind of lovely. And then I thought, oh, it's a bit weird. Like, when is she watching over me? Like all the time, or just at moments, or like, that doesn't seem right. Yeah. And I think that was sort of the beginning of the undoing of it all, where I was just like, the first time I lost someone that meant a lot to me. Yeah. And I kind of thought, well, what is heaven, and how, you know, and that's how you get there, but I don't necessarily, you know, and when you start really thinking, and you're at that age and you start thinking, just think, yeah, no, I don't think so. And I found a lot more comfort, and I think I do, in just thinking of that you have your time and then you pass.
And that sounds like it was quite an easy transition for you, but because some people, as you say, almost feel like a loss. They feel that sense of reassurance or that sense of meaning or connectedness, and they feel that they're left with this sort of cold scientific worldview that maybe lacks meaning. It doesn't feel like you felt that in the same way. I mean, did it feel like a strange thing to give up? How open were you with family and friends about it? Did it feel meaningful, or was it just a background thing that faded?
I mean, I stopped going to church, so that was like a noticeable thing for my family. But my parents are very liberal and very much like, as long as you're happy and you live however you wish that makes you happy, then that's great. And my mum is, while she is Christian, she's very liberal in her views and very pro-gay marriage and all these other things that, you know, sometimes religion can dogmatize and make, you know, bad. But you know, for me to announce I was atheist at 16, I don't think it was the biggest shock. It was a bit like when I went vegetarian at 14, actually, as well, where my mum had just sort of tried for many years to prevent me knowing that that's where I was going. And then eventually I was like, I'm going to veg. She was like, well, you can cook for yourself, or I'll cook for myself. I think that's absolutely fine by me.
Yeah,
you
know? Resigned to it and let you go.
Yeah, so I think it's obviously just an age where I was just coming to knowing myself rather than just listening and accepting everything that I was told. And I think, yeah, and I did a silent meditation retreat for 10 days a couple of years ago, and it evolved my thinking then, actually, where, well, I just had a moment. It sounds a bit, yeah. I think you have to do a silent meditation to understand how your brain sort of starts slowing and everything, just feels very much more intense. But yeah, I just sat there and was kind of looking at the cosmos, looking at the sky, and just felt like, oh, I understand it. Like, it's just energy. We're all energy. The stars are energy. We're energy. Just energy flowing everywhere. And I just sort of, to me, that was like, oh yeah, that's it. That makes total sense to me. Yeah, I'm good.
Yeah, yeah.
So, and that sort of felt transformative. I think it was like, yeah, I wouldn't say I was spiritual in any way, but then that feels quite like a spiritual moment, but it doesn't really change it. I still put everything in science, really. And
Yeah.
so,
yeah, and it's similar to my experience, I think, because with some people, they're drawn away from a sort of religious worldview because of problems they see in the ethics. So some of the other people I've interviewed was, this sort of explicit homophobia or sexism, and just like, this can't be right. With other people, and it sounds like you and I are a bit more like this. It was partly that, but it was more, the evidence, and it doesn't really hang together, and I just don't see how this thing makes sense. But interestingly, that experience of focusing more deeply on your own consciousness, your own sentience, and the character of that experience moment to moment, whether it's through meditation or for some people psychedelics, or with some people that leads them back to a religious or a supernatural worldview. And it's not often a formalized religion. It is more of a spiritual sense of there's something out there. But I followed a similar path to you, where I get that sense of awe and wonder and connectedness from a completely naturalistic understanding of the fact that, we are all stardust, and we're all patterns of energy and information processing,
exactly.
and we are all, ultimately one. I think, a religious person would call that a spiritual experience, but I think you and I probably feel just the same sense of emotion and connection and meaning from that naturalistic worldview as some people get from the supernatural. Obviously, I'm biased, right? But I think our sense of it at least is grounded in reality, so it feels even more powerful and meaningful to me. We don't need some sort of cold scientific worldview that strips out emotion and meaning. So
yeah, no, definitely, I'm totally with you. That's very true.
And one of the things that sometimes holds people back from moving away from a religion, and it doesn't sound like this was a constraint on you either, it seems like that was quite a natural shift, is that their morality is bound up in their religion or their supernatural thinking, so that what good and bad, although they might have a common sense understanding of suffering being negative and flourishing and life being positive, ultimately good and bad is really determined by the nature of a deity or rules in a book. So they're very nervous that even if they're questioning the epistemological, is this really real, they're nervous about giving it up because they feel like they're going to lose their moral moorings, and they no longer will be good and bad, and does anything go under that circumstance? It doesn't feel like that's been a problem for you, but without that, the supernatural or religious worldview, what would you say your morality is based on? And again, it would be interesting to know from childhood how that shifted. What do you think? How would you define good and bad? And over time, how have you changed your thinking about what entities deserve our moral consideration or compassion?
Yeah. Ooh, it's interesting, isn't it? Because my first feeling when people have said, well, how do you know what's good and bad? It's like, how do you not know what's good and bad? Would be my kind of question. I don't really understand how you could contemplate, at the most basic level, doing something to someone that hurts them and not understand that probably is bad. I don't need a God to tell me that. Be nice, like care for people, look out for people.
It almost seems tautological, doesn't it? That...
Yeah. So I struggle when people say, well, how do you find your moral compass? I think if you go back to the fundamentals of what it should mean to be human and what it should mean to be a decent person, it's very simple. Like, care for people, don't do things to people you wouldn't like to be done to you. Like, if it's that simple. And I think you can raise children very clearly with empathy and understanding that if that hurts somebody else, don't do it. And definitely as a child, I was probably a lot more conscious that I've done something bad. Argue with my brother or some brothers and got in trouble or whatever, and thinking, or praying to God and saying, oh, I'm sorry. But I didn't need to pray to God to be sorry. Like, I was sorry. Like, I knew I shouldn't have done it. I didn't need to do that. But I can also, actually, we were talking about this only a couple of days ago in my team about people enjoy prayer for the routine of it, the feeling you get of doing prayer, and that actually you can do it even without believing in God. And I think I wonder now that
the
I
ritual,
meditate,
the sense of doing things together.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the ritual and that kind of thing. And I meditate daily, and I find that ritual very rewarding. And that's been driven. I really got into it because of Sam Harris and his scientific approach to it all. I thought, okay, well, I can probably try this.
Yeah,
It sounds
the
very
value of
scientifically sound.
examining and experiencing your own consciousness without the woo and the
Yeah,
supernatural and the
exactly.
yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So and I've started doing the gratitude things, which actually I found I always was a bit like, yeah. But they said, you know, if you do gratitude every day, so at the end of meditation, I do a gratitude of whatever, how many things.
Yeah.
And again, that's been really rewarding as well. And it's kind of, I guess there is those things in prayer and in those things that you do miss if you just completely devoid yourself of anything and you just do the rat race and you're not really thinking any more broadly. But there's other things out there that are very meditation sound, and it's, you know, scientifically sound for what it does to your brain and everything else, and the gratitude thing as well. It's just about thinking about what you're grateful for and appreciating, and it brings more appreciation to your life. Like those kind of things you can do without ever having to think that I'm doing this so that I go to heaven or whatever it is that people do.
Yeah.
So.
And I think it almost seems trivial to explain it that way, that it's just about the nature and quality of my experience and caring about the nature and quality of other people's experience and other beings' experience. But that to me actually is the solid grounding for morality. You know, you can go down a relativistic route where you say anything goes, right? And we know that can lead to awful suffering and harm if a group of people with power just decide arbitrarily to exclude certain humans or other beings from their moral circle. You can also go down the supernatural path where you take a, you know, set of rules or a human interpretation of what a deity apparently believes is good. And again, we know the suffering and harm that can be caused by putting something as more important than sentient beings in our experience. But I think we probably share this middle ground where relativism is arbitrary, the supernatural is somewhat arbitrary. Both don't have to be harmful, but often are. But if you ground your morality very simply in the quality of experience of sentient beings, right, suffering and flourishing, you come to this conclusion of suffering is bad and flourishing is good, and that's sort of it, right? And and I don't think we should be ashamed of that, because I think there are some people who are almost too clever and just think it's too simple, so they can't accept it. But I think it feels right, and it's well grounded. It's grounded in a naturalistic understanding of what it is to be a sentient being and what sentience actually is. And your point about meditation I think is fascinating, because in a simplistic way, there's two ways of improving our own sentient experience. One is making everything in the world better and the inputs to our brain better, and the other one is actually working on the processing of our mind itself, and without doing surgery or some sort of weird biotech. You know, meditation is a really powerful way of doing that and directly enhancing the quality of your own sentient experience. So yeah, it's interesting. Another journey that lots of people come through, and you've hinted at yours as well, is that many people will start out with that common sense understanding of morality, but it will be restricted to a certain group. It might be family or friends or a nation or humanity as a whole. And often a massive step that most people on the planet haven't yet taken is going beyond humans as well. And you talked about, you know, going vegetarian and so on, but what was your journey to expanding your moral circle and starting to think about the sheer range of beings that you might need to actually care about morally?
Yeah, I always wanted to be a vet, like forever. There's never a time when I thought that was something else I wanted to do. And when I was about 10, I was volunteering at a wildlife sanctuary, like trying, you know, rehabilitating hedgehogs and things like that.
What was driving that wish? Why did you want to be a vet?
I just always wanted to heal animals. I've always, it sounds so corny. And when I say I don't really know how to describe it, because it's just the reality. I just love animals. I always have had an affinity for them. And I think anyone that loves animals kind of knows what that is. And then other people that don't have any love for animals kind of don't really get it. Like, what do you mean you got this like affinity? It's just like I've always just been fascinated by them, always wanted to care for them, always wanted to make them my friend. Like, that, you know, that's always been the way it's been. And I don't know why. My dad is my family on his side is very kind of animal orientated, and always had animals around, and I got to embrace my love of animals through his passion of bird watching and kind of going out there and seeing animals and that kind of thing. So I was lucky that I had a father that also kind of had that innate love of animals.
And did you have companion animals at home in the family, or?
Yes, we had cats, and we had a series of poor goldfish that I feel very bad about, and a rabbit that I also feel really bad about because we only have one rabbit. But yes, we did have did have those animals, but my dad would be the kind of person to stop a car and pick up a rescue seagull that would like hold traffic back for 20 minutes until he got that seagull and put it in his car, and then we'd look after it for a couple of weeks, and I'd take it to the sanctuary where I was like. So I loved being around animals and helping animals. And I think I did want to be vegetarian from a much younger age, but I also wanted to be a vet, and I was told, and I understand because we didn't really know stuff back then. I think my mum she did just want the best for me, but she's like, it'll stunt your growth, you know, you won't get the right nutrients and all this kind of, I'm pretty tall, so maybe I could have done with a little bit of stunting your growth, but there we go. But also like brain power, I should be like, well, you know, you've got to keep that brain power to be a vet. So, but it was when I sat at the table at Christmas Day and there was this huge turkey, and my uncle said, wow, imagine what size that turkey was when it was live. And I was like, yeah, I'm done. I'm done. Okay, I've got the image now and it's not going.
It was that clean.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I can't do this anymore. And when I was in vet school, I actually went to an AI unit, so an artificial insemination unit, which holds bulls for semen, obviously, to inseminate dairy cows. And I was so shocked because the bulls are kept tethered most of the day. They're tethered, and then for 20 minutes they get to go to this little pit in the middle that had like a branch where they could like let out some steam, and then they'd be put back, and then they use like electroejaculation to get the semen. And it was just shocking. All of it was shocking. It's very shocking to do that kind of procedure. Clearly is very distressing for them. Plus they're tethered and they just look so depressed. Yeah. And when a cow looks depressed, oh my God, don't know they're depressed. They just look so sad.
They're very expressive.
Yeah, exactly. And I remember sitting on the coach and everyone else was like, no, is nobody else shocked from this? Like, I've got to stop eating dairy. Like, I can't do this. Like, this is, and everyone on that coach, it's like, I don't see the problem. And I was very good friends with some Irish guys who I lived with, who obviously born and bred generations of dairy and beef.
Yeah.
Very much ingrained in the Irish kind of psyche of agriculture. And it just talked me out of it, which I feel kind of disappointed in myself that I kind of let that happen. But it did, and I put my goggles back on of just pretending it didn't really exist. It's fine, sort of thing. When I went to Compassionate World Farming, and I was for the first time surrounded by a number of people that were vegan, and one of those was Phil Brook. He's this wonderful man who has worked at Compassion for so many years, and he is incredible. We call him the Oracle because he just knows everything about everything. He's like a really fascinating guy, and he was vegan, and he was in my team, and we talk and things. I just thought, I've got to go vegan, and he was very encouraging. And you just need sometimes you just need those people around you to. Because in my friendship circle, I was always the one that cared about everything. Versus like you need someone that cares more to like take you on that journey almost. Yeah. So then myself and my housemate at the time, who worked at Compassion as well, we both went vegan together at the same time, and yeah, that was really good. But I guess also in terms of the moral circle of not just looking at non-human animals, but looking at humans as well. I think I always cared about more broadly than just my family or even just the country that we're in, kind of thing. I've never been particularly nationalist or anything like that, but I went to Ghana. I didn't get into vet school the first year around, so I ended up going to Ghana to experience veterinary practice out there, which is this incredible experience. But it was my first understanding of colonialism and really seeing the impact of that, and went to the castle where the slaves used to leave for Ghana, and that was a really poignant point in my life where I just thought I have to do more to counteract what we've done for so many centuries and got involved in sort of more human rights things as well, where, for instance, you know, on a personal note, stopping buying things that weren't organic cotton and things because of the use of pesticides and the poisoning it does for people, and actually did some work with the Environmental Justice Foundation on cotton farming. Thought about things like coffee and chocolate, because in Ghana they do chocolate and all these things that I never, I'm ashamed to say, at the age of 18 or whatever, I just hadn't really thought, like, what happens to the people that grow our coffee, or what happens to the people that grow our chocolate? And that was, I would say, in terms of beginning to think about my personal impact on the world, it was definitely then that I was like, oh, okay, I need to do a lot more and be a lot more aware of how my personal impact is something that we all could do more about, and I must try harder to try and at least reduce that.
And it's a really difficult balance, because I think there's almost there's a very negative sort of cognitive dissonance that, you know, I certainly experienced it. My journey was much longer than yours on some of these topics as well, where we deliberately avoid thinking about something because we don't want to make a change that particularly feels socially awkward. As you say, if you're the only person who's about to do it, and something like veganism or atheism, or if it feels weird and unusual and strange and like people will look at you funny, the power of that is absolutely incredible. And it's frustrating because we like to think of ourselves as sort of rational, careful thinkers that will just follow the logic and there's the answer, but it just doesn't work. Even for, you know, the most rational, careful thinkers, the social constraints are really strong. So there's almost that negative cognitive dissonance that holds us back. But I've been thinking recently that just to stay sane, you almost need a bit of cognitive dissonance just to protect yourself, because as your moral circle expands and you think about all 8 billion people on the planet and the suffering and the challenges that many of them are facing, as you know, we live our privileged, cozy little lives in Brighton and London. And as you extend your moral circle out to include non-human animals, given suffering in the wild and what we do deliberately to them in animal farming, there's a degree to which, just to protect yourself, you need a bit of cognitive dissonance just to say, look, I have to look after myself and the people around me, and there's only so much I can do, and you know, I can have a broad moral circle, but I still need to prioritize. And so it's a tricky balance, and some people find that balance by keeping too narrow and they never break the cognitive dissonance. Other people go too broad and then really struggle and end up burning out because they're trying to solve all of the world's problems when they're just one person. It's hard.
Yeah, I agree. I think that is definitely a thing. And you're right, it just leads to burnout, because if you think about it too greatly, it's just overwhelming, the level of suffering. And one of the things, I read an article the other day about a guy who ended up in a coma in a vegetative state, but he was actually conscious for 8 years. He lay there and they didn't think he could communicate. And honestly, I don't think I could imagine anything worse. I just, you read that book, what's it called? The Bell.
And the Butterfly, isn't it?
Butterfly and the Bell or something. Anyway, from that guy that was also in that state. And yet he's so thankful to be alive now. He's so thankful that because he came out of it and he can communicate, and he says it changed his life, and you know, all these kind of things. And I just think sometimes how we perceive suffering and what it actually is for that person to experience it sometimes can be different. Like I can get really, if I think too much, I can just think, oh, there's just all this suffering and it's unbearable, and how can you exist? And yet people in their individual experience might say, well, actually I'm all right. Things aren't great, but I'm happy to be alive still. And I think everyone's degrees are different to that. And so with that, you can be a bit pragmatic about always trying to do more, but not going so far that you basically burn yourself into the ground.
I think that's another tricky thing to do, because one thing is just to focus on your own perspective. The next step is to care about the perspectives of others in a way that really is just a reflection of your own needs and interests. And the next level is to genuinely try to, whether it's empathize or feel compassion with how their perspective actually is. And sometimes that's worse than we might think, and sometimes, as you say, it's better, and we might have a naive view of what it's actually like to be that person or be that being. So
yeah, definitely. And that's where I come a bit unstuck with the wild animal suffering, because I never liked nature programs. I could never watch them. I always just thought that I don't know how anyone can watch like these terrible things happening to animals.
They feel like snuff movies to me now.
Yeah, it's just a horror show, but it's real life. It's just, why would you want to watch someone's artery being ripped from their leg? Like, I just don't. It's just not. I never got it, and I was always seen as oversensitive, and that's the way it is. It's natural, like that's nature's way. And I'd be like, well, nature's cruel. And they're like, yeah, nature's cruel. It's like, well, okay, but that doesn't make it all right, like this whole situation. Yeah. And yet you're then in that dilemma, right? I also don't want the animal to starve to death. So what now? Go on, sorry.
Yeah, and that's, it's a controversial topic, even amongst vegans and animal advocates, because many will look at suffering in the wild and say, well, it's part of nature, therefore it must be okay. And I'm like, well, in the same way as just categorizing a pig as a farmed animal doesn't help the pig
No.
and its experience of suffering, saying to an antelope or a fish that's being pursued, oh, but you're in the wild, so it's okay, doesn't change its actual experience of the suffering. And that's what sentientism is about, is actually caring about their experience of the suffering.
Mm-hmm.
They don't care what category we have arbitrarily decided to put them in to make ourselves feel better. And while that doesn't mean any of the answers are easy, because it's right to be, very cautious about human impact on the wild, and we have enormous negative impact on the wild already. So I don't know why we should be too prissy about intervening, but we should be right about human hubris and intervening in complex ecosystems where we don't understand the unintended consequences. Those are all very valid, important concerns. We need so much more research before we can be confident about what we do. That doesn't mean you exclude those beings from your moral circle. You can still say that suffering matters, that suffering in the wild is morally salient, but yes, we should be prudent about how and when to intervene. So I find that that's a strange cognitive dissonance even within the animal advocacy movement that many people have. And encouragingly, you're already starting to see some practical shifts in that direction as well. So if you don't take that sentientist view and you just think about humans, it's remarkable that whatever the problem is in the wild, whether it's overpopulation of deer or transmission of disease, the answer seems to be kill them all, right? So, the answer is just like, just kill them, right? Cull them. That's just the default answer. Whereas at least if you do shift your moral calculus and include thinking about those badgers or those deer or whatever it is, or in your thinking, we're already seeing some shift of thinking about, well, instead of killing them, why don't we think about immunocontraception or building fences or some other means that helps us to get a balance that has some compassion built in. And there's some fascinating movements like compassionate conservationism that Mark Beckhoff is trying to progress, which is saying, look, yes, this environmental concern is super important and really powerful, but you've got to do it based on compassion for the sentient beings within it. So.
Yeah, there's so many things there. I think if I go back to the veterinary mindset and like conservationist mindset versus that mindset that you speak of, where we preserve red squirrels because the grey squirrels are killing them, but the grey squirrels also matter. Their experience is no different to the red squirrel. Why are you deciding the red squirrel has more worth? Because it's rarer, so therefore in definition we always decide that things that are more rare have more worth. I just can't really get my head around that. And I've heard those debates in the veterinary world a lot, but I mean, I don't think it's unusual outside that as well. And I think coming back to how it can all be too much, because if you think about wild animal suffering on its scale, it's pretty overwhelming. And even on a vegan diet, you're killing mice every year just from cutting corn and things. Like, there's only so much you can do, and I think that's always worth bearing in mind. But I think that's, why I work on kind of factory farming as it is because there's something we can do that's so obvious right now. And I don't think we shouldn't be looking at wild animal suffering, because I think you have to start somewhere to be able to find that information that you talk of, so that we can do things that are more compassionate. But right now, there are billions suffering in systems that are definitely we don't need, that we can definitely do away with without having to worry about any consequences to other systems, other than it's likely to improve the world and everything that lives in it. So for me, it's important to have those conversations about wild animal suffering, but it goes back to, what do those animals feel? And if you're truly negative utilitarian and everything else, and you just want to plow down the rainforest because there's so many animals that suffer in it, I have that in my mind sometimes, and I think, no, but I don't know what their experience is. I don't know what it's like to be in a vegetative state and still want to live like that guy. We can assume that because they've got a parasite that they're suffering a lot. And they probably are, but they may still have a will to live, this intrinsic thing that's kind of hard to explain, where you still want to live even when things are terrible or whatever. They could be definitely experiencing that. And who are we to take that away from them? That's where I kind of come a bit unstuck. But I do think with disease and things like that, and there was a recent article about the noise pollution and the impact that has on certain birds, which we've known for a long time, but this was saying how it impacts reproduction and causes stress in these birds. So again, there's a lot of things that we do as humans that we could stop right now that would actively reduce the suffering of wild animals.
I agree. And I think, and this is where I'd like to come on to the final section of the conversation, is how do we make the world a better place and fix all of the problems? And I think there is a really interesting balance there, because there's a lot of intellect and emotion gets poured into some really, really challenging, difficult, intractable moral problems where it's super hard to understand the answer. And there are some others where it's just bloody obvious.
Yeah.
Right? It's really obvious, right? There's no, the argument is basically over. We're done. Let's just stop. So in that context, because I think we might agree there as well about how we prioritize those things. If we imagine a world where we persuaded most of the 8 billion people on the planet to agree with us, they now use evidence and reason to think about what's real and what to believe in. They hold a series of provisional and probabilistic beliefs, but they're always open-minded and open to new evidence and grounded in reality. And they also have a broad moral circle that says, every sentient being that can experience suffering or flourishing or experience anything warrants moral consideration, right? So we're all in the same camp now. What would that future look like for, I guess, human ethics, non-human ethics, farmed animals, wild animals, and how long might it take us to get there? And you can go sort of super sci-fi, future, or you can think more immediately about the things that you and Humane League UK are working on now, and how we can drive that forward, given how much that sort of weight of social norm is a constraint on us doing the right things.
Yeah, that weight of the economy, as we see even with COVID, right, and how it just drives everything and all decisions.
Yeah.
Sometimes understandably, and other times not so much. We are seeing more change now than we've seen in the last 50 years for farm animals, in that they've been intensified for however long, and now finally we're beginning to break those systems. It doesn't seem unrealistic to me that as this process is happening, as we're breaking down these systems, we're moving the conscience of consumers to a higher level in terms of thinking, okay, well, no, I shouldn't eat eggs from caged animals. That is bad. In that process, people start to think and care more about animals just through the very nature of it. And that is another positive thing that comes from making these changes, where people do start to think more about this. And then beyond that, we have cultured meat, we have plant-based options, we have impending climate change, which no doubt the Western world needs to do more, because it's going to impact the rest of the world even more. And I think as a country and society in general, are beginning to see that. We see every year Veganuary is getting more popular. I see within my friendship group, people cutting down their meat, trying alternatives, enjoying the alternatives. We're way past the nut cutlet that I no longer eat from when I was 14. Thankful.
Veganism is becoming slightly less weird, do you think?
Totally less weird. Totally less weird, I'd say. It's, I talk to people now and they know what it is.
That's progress. That's progress.
It's progress, yeah. And people kind of often now, I think I've seen a change in the conversation over the last 5 years. Maybe brought on by Greta with her climate activism, I think, because it's brought it to home for people more. And because maybe my friends are having children now. So they're at that age where they're starting to think about the next generation and what that means for them. So that they are kind of thinking, the conversation is now, I should cut down. I do try to buy, free range, and we don't eat meat 3 times a week now, whereas we used to. And that that did not happen 3 or 4 years ago. And so I think we are at a period where people are beginning to recognize the impact they can have in making better choices and being more conscious in what they do. And so as we end these cage systems, as we move towards higher welfare chicken and these things, that's not enough. That's not where we see the end. The end needs to be stopping farming of animals. And if I'm honest, I'll be very happy when we don't, people say, well, what about the pigs? You'll lose that. Those pigs don't want to be living like that. That's not how I want to live. And much like animals in zoos, we preserve species that don't want to live like that. So why are we preserving them? It's that human psyche of the rarity, and everything else comes back to that, right? That we must preserve.
Yeah, and a species can't experience anything. A species isn't sentient.
Exactly.
You cannot have moral compassion for a species. Caring about a species is really a human concern about rarity and enjoying wildlife because it's pretty and we enjoy watching it on programs. It's really a reflection of an anthropocentric concern, not a genuine concern for the individual beings that are suffering. So
yeah, definitely. So I think if we take 2050 as probably around about, I think we will be looking at a very different food system to the one we are now, where people are eating cultured meat, they are eating more plant-based option. If there is farming, it's probably dwindling to a much, much lesser degree, because the reality is it does take time for farmers and the economy and everything else to keep track of these changes, and that's what really holds our progress back. Because even in these companies that I would very much like to change, you have people in there wanting to make this change, but there's just so many barriers along the way, and so it does take far too long, and it costs many millions and billions of animals in that time. But we are getting there, and we are pushing forward, and we have the Open Wing Alliance working on ending cages around the world. And to me, I find that incredibly inspiring, because in countries where we have a colleague in Japan, Maho, and she's working against where there isn't even awareness within consumers about what does it mean that there's a hen in a cage. Well, it shows a picture of a hen in a cage on the package. I don't mind. And, you've got to work with that. That is challenging. We at least over, in this country particularly, I think there is this pride in how we care about animals. And even if I would argue that it's very misplaced in that we don't do nearly enough, let alone for pets, let alone anything else. There is that thing in the human psyche in the UK of being proud to be caring about animals, and we do have that.
And I try and share that optimism that it does feel like things have shifted rapidly. Veganism feels like it's where vegetarianism was 10, 15 years ago. Big brands and big companies are now comfortably marketing vegan products or non-animal products, and there's shift. It's always too slow, but it feels like it's becoming more mainstream, and it might be approaching some sort of tipping point where these things just become normal and accepted. At the same time, the thing we actually care about, the numbers of animals being farmed and slaughtered, that graph keeps going up globally, partly because of what should be a good thing, which is economic development in many other countries, and India and China.
Absolutely.
and as people get richer, eating meat is something they decide they want to do, or it's a status thing, whatever. What's your sense of how globally that might shift? Are we going to have this painful situation where countries like the UK maybe reach that tipping point and start to tail off, but then we watch India and China and others just crush all of the progress we've made by following the awful path that we've followed?
I get the impression that we might be lagging behind places like Asia and India and like the South America, depending obviously on who's in charge in certain countries. Brazil right now is struggling, of course, but then you look at places like Costa Rica, and they're incredibly inspiring countries that really believe and look at the ecology of the system. And I think, but in Europe, we don't have that kind of more broad, well, obviously some people do, but on a larger scale in terms of government and how they're looking, doesn't tend to have this kind of ecological worldview on things. And a lot of other cultures, India or in Asia, obviously you can't lump Asia into different places, but if we take Taiwan, where we have an amazing charity called East working there, they've done incredible work. And it is, sometimes we can feel like, but actually it's us, the Western world, that's consuming the most, that's doing all the damage to everybody else. And we hear things coming out of China, for instance, where obviously consumption is getting higher, factory farming numbers are going up and up and up, but at the same time there does appear to be an acknowledgement at a higher level of government that isn't something they can sustain, and that they need to reduce again. And they have in their cultures, which we don't seem to have in ours, this ability to eat tofu and not have dairy and all these things. So there's a good chance we could be hopeful that they skip the stage that we've just gone through for the last 100 years of thinking wealth means we eat meat. And it does seem to be happening, that there's a recognition that that's not sustainable within it, and their culture is better. Like, thank goodness that exists, and it's our culture that's the problem, and it's probably us that will have the longest route to go, I suspect, sadly.
I think you might be right. And that's one of the odd things about some of the social dynamics around both the naturalistic side of sentientism and the sentiocentric side, the broad moral circle of sentientism, is that some people think it's, something that's developed from European, the humanist enlightenment, over the last few hundred centuries, and now we're imposing it everywhere else. And it's like, well, it has a lot in common with those themes, but it didn't come from there. It's the roots of naturalism run really, really deep in African, European, Asian cultures in almost every respect. But also, so does that concern for non-human animals as well. So if you look back into religious and non-religious cultures, whether it's Buddhism or Jainism or Rastafarianism, or there are really deep cultural roots that show a reverence and a concern for non-human animals and the environment. And as you say, actually have food cultures and product cultures that are much less dependent on animal products as well. So I think you're right. There's sort of cultural reservoirs of morality there that are much better than the ones in the cultures that we live in today that we can bring to the fore. But also the technological innovation you talked about. Many of those countries are investing more heavily and moving more quickly at finding much more ethical and less environmentally impactful solutions to these problems than the US and the UK and some of the supposedly developed economies are. So if the announcement this week about in Singapore with the cultured no-kill chicken, for example, I think you're right that they're actually going to be able to not follow our awful path, but actually find a much better, more radical path, and we'll end up following in their wake. So
yeah, I think so. And I think we also have to look to what are we exporting, because that's another thing. There's companies now taking the cages that we're crushing, and if they're not being properly crushed, they're actually being exported now to Rwanda or Uganda or Kenya. So they're just exporting factory farming to other, and just going to destroy economies that are working and growing in a way that works for a very rural population, a lot of rural population where they are selling livestock on a small scale and things, and having these massive factory farms come in. And that's on us again, that it's coming from us. We're exporting these cages, selling them cheap, telling people this is the way forward for the food system.
Similar to what we've done with energy and climate change and manufacturing, right? We go, oh, we're nice and clean because look, we've reduced our manufacturing, but we buy 10 times as much from elsewhere. We've just exported the emissions elsewhere, and
we have a long way to go. But I am hopeful, and I do think there's change afoot. And I hope it happens in time, that it would be 2050, people won't be eating meat nearly as readily as they are now, if at all, hopefully. And then beyond that, caring about wild animals, caring about the impact we have, caring more about destroying these natural worlds that we've kind of spent the last 150 years.
And I share that optimistic cast, because I think there's that latent moral stance that most people have. And most people don't like factory farming. Most people don't want sentient animals to suffer. Ironically, I think we'll find that both the technological advancement, when the alternatives become cheap, easy, fast, ubiquitous, and when society sees that stuff as normal, we'll see people, just ending their use of animal products without even having taken an ethical decision. And what that might do, oddly, is to then free them to improve their ethics to match their behavior, because we know how hard it is to get a personal change to bring your behavior in line with your ethics. Sadly, if we can change the societal norms and the institutional drives, and the technological advancement will just make the alternatives just blindingly obviously better in every respect, then change can happen surprisingly fast.
Yeah, I think so. And I've seen it in friends that have gone vegetarian or vegan who did it for health or environment, that they could then have this kind of a view that it was bad to factory farm, but be very vocal about it and oh, I could never do that now, and blah, blah. And in a way they never could before, because they couldn't bring themselves to think about it. And it wasn't until they were no longer participating in it that they can open their minds to actually really understanding the suffering that's going on there, rather than kind of, no, I can't hear too much about that. I don't.
They can allow themselves to really think about it, because they're no longer complicit, they're no longer guilty, and therefore, you're able to think it through. Imagine we can get to that world where, at least in terms of farming animals, we've managed to basically bring an end to that. What do you think that progress might do for human ethics?
There's so much tied into the abuse of animals that happens to abuse of people, be it from, if we talk about fishing and the pirate fishing and the people that exist on those boats that aren't fed, that don't get, that don't get a wage, that are enslaved on those boats or trafficked there. Or if we think about, most recently, it's been the press, particularly in the US, but over here, slaughterhouses, and just how bad it is, the conditions, the working conditions for people that live in those, that work in those environments. those kind of things we all need to be thinking more about. And yet, again, I think it's too challenging to kind of contemplate, because you don't want to really think about the amount of suffering that goes in. It's hard enough to block out the animals, and then people want you to think about humans as well. And so I think our ethics in and of itself will forge forward with a more compassion and hopefully more socialistic kind of view of wanting people to not be in these working conditions that cause untold misery, I think it's safe to say, and just so that we can have cheap food.
Yeah.
I think once we can get out that cycle and start building a much more fairer economy, then humans can take ethics to another level, and they probably can have the space as well to expand their ethics further and further, because I think as soon as you start getting into these things, you start realizing how many more layers there are that you need to kind of think about.
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant point. It's almost that we're trapped into a fairly awful ethical state just by tradition and social norms and where we've come from, and the fact that we were all taught from birth this is completely normal. And if we can free ourselves from that, I think that could also have a revolutionary effect on the quality and richness and power of our human ethics as well. And maybe that's a good sort of hopeful note to end on. I think if we can, ending animal farming will be a win for farmed animals, it'll be a win for the environment, and it will be a win for human animals too. So we just need to get on with it. So enormous thanks to you and Humane League for all the work you do in pushing that critical agenda forward. So
thank you so much. It's been really wonderful to have this discussion. It's
really
great. And it's really great seeing the work you're doing, and I'm looking forward to hearing more podcasts from people you bring on. So
thank you. They've been fascinating conversations so far. It's been an honor to have you on. So before we wrap up, what's the best way people following your work and the work of Humane League UK?
So we have our website where you can check out the humaneleague.org.uk. We're on Facebook, of course, the Humane League UK, and you could follow our Twitter account and Instagram, again, Humane League UK. And I'm actually also on Twitter. That's Vicky Bond _THLUK. If you're interested in following me too, I'm happy to follow you back as well, because I'm sure people listening to this will be very interesting to see what they're posting as well. So check our work. And if you want to get more involved in our work, which we welcome, we have something called a Fast Action Network. So we just put out some small actions. They only take a couple of minutes, digital actions to do online, like sign a petition or write to a company. It's very quick. It only takes a couple of minutes, but that impact alone is how we get our commitments, because the companies hear from the public, they see that this is something that needs to happen, and that helps push it. So if you go onto our website, you can look at how to get involved, and then you can find the Fast Action Network there as well, and you can sign up to our newsletter as well.
Great, that's a brilliant idea, because for a lot of people, the block on contributing and campaigning and volunteering is that it feels too much commitment. People have busy lives and families and economic pressures as well. So to have that sort of toolkit where you can just take a couple of minutes and go do something good, that's a great idea. So
Definitely.
Yeah, well, I hope the people who listen to and watch this will pick up and go carry out some of those actions for you. So
yeah, thank you. Well, check us out, everyone.
Brilliant. Well, thank you again so much, Vicky. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you, and let's stay in touch. And it's great to have you linked with our groups too.
Thanks so much for the invite. Take care.